It's good to hear that there's some progress in a key industry like cloud computing. But, I worry that, this is sort of this piecemeal approach, chipping away at a big problem, industry by industry. I was in China all of last week and actually saw Eunice, which was great to see. And we talked about this as well. I think the framework the Chinese are using is wrapped around this new foreign investment law that was passed a couple of weeks ago by the National People's Congress. And it's a law that still preserves the so-called negative list, which excludes 40 or 50 industries from any relaxation of standards. The language on forced technology transfer is very vague. I think there's still some broad implementation issues that don't address ownership caps and the joint venture structure. I think a far more preferable approach would be to restart the negotiations that the two countries have engaged in over the last 10 years on a bilateral investment treaty. This is a much more effective way in dealing with the legacy issues of joint ventures and the allegations of forced technology transfer that takes place there.
Stephen, you mentioned the vagueness of this new foreign investment law. The U.S. side says that enforcement will be key, and it will be enforced through talks, bilateral talks with government officials at every level, local to ministerial level, and that they will rely on U.S. companies to tell them when China is not holding up their end of the bargain. What U.S. company is going to do that if the risk is more escalation, more tariffs, and potentially some sort of regulatory backlash in China?
Well, that gets to the thorny issue of forced technology transfer. We know that when companies go into China and they form joint ventures, that they willingly do that, number one, because they want to get a piece of the market. And when you go into business with a Chinese partner, of course you share people, ideas, strategies, and the technology associated with the business that you're in. The question is, are companies forced to do this? And, the U.S. Trade Representative in his famous Section 301 report a year ago admitted they don't have any evidence that the transfer of technology is forced. So they rely on these surveys of companies who say they're uncomfortable. But, the allegation of forcing is not verifiable by him. And you're right, companies themselves who enter into these agreements are not going to own up to the fact that, they were taken into a dark room and their hands were tied behind their back and they were forced to turn over the blueprints to their processes.
Well, Stephen, you mentioned that you just returned from China. I'm curious what your read is on the economy there. We just saw the premier at the Boao Forum cutting interest rates, saying that China has a lot of policy tools that it can continue to use. Who has more leverage economically, and how much is this global slowdown playing into the likelihood or lack of a likelihood for a deal?
Well, one thing, the premier doesn't cut interest rates. I mean, the central bank does. I mean, the premier was talking about the fact
that it was in the works.
He was talking about the fact that they have a lot of optionality on policy. There's no question that there's a lot of downward pressure in the Chinese economy late last year, continuing into the first several months of this year. Reports of sharp contractions in industrial profits in January and February that came out yesterday were an indication of that. But they've already taken a lot of policy actions on the monetary front, with cutting reserve requirements 5 times in the last year. There's an announced cut in the VAT tax scheduled for April 1, just coming up, and then another cut in Social Security taxes coming up in May. I think that'll stabilize the economy by the middle of the year, and you'll see some gradual improvement in the second half. I think the Chinese economy will come out of this current downshift in reasonably good shape, committed to their longer-term structural rebalancing issues. There are question marks about the global economy, and I agree with that. Those are serious and likely to impact policy decisions both in China and the United States, I might add, as well.